Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us on another Hemp Hotline webinar. I'm appreciative of all of you who've been supporting us over the past 4 years. It's 2020, and I'm truly excited for all the new regulations that are starting. I'm excited for the opportunity to educate the community even more this year via video. It's going to be an exciting time for us to help each other as a community and help each other do things the right way. It's a lot of changes are coming down the pipeline, and the purpose of Hemp Hotline and other tools that we use to help educate you is all about being on par when it comes to regulation and just to educate the community members on what's going on so that everybody is safe and that the CBD products you buy is valued correctly, especially when it comes to you spending your money as a consumer. And then also this is an opportunity for brands to step up and be a beacon of light for the community members. So with that said, I'm excited today to introduce Mary Beth. She's a laboratory analyst at Encore Labs in Pasadena. And it's one of the first licensed cannabis compliance labs in California. And she's mainly responsible for all terpene and residual solvent testing done in the lab, but she also maintains GCMS and HPLC instrumentation. Before coming to Encore Labs, Mary Beth spent 5 years as a business manager and an associate instructor at Axion Analytical Labs in Chicago, Illinois. So she has a wide variety of experience when it comes to working in labs. And Axion Analytical Lab is one of the only facilities of its kind dedicated to hands-on chromatography training courses. And she also has a degree in chemistry for Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. So thank you so much, Mary Beth, for being here.
Thank you so much, Bevan, for having me. I'm excited.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. So can you just give us a little background about you personally, and then also how you got started at Encore Labs?
Sure. So you kind of nailed it there with a little short resume of mine, but I went to school for chemistry. That was kind of always an interest of mine growing up, even before, you really get to chemistry classes. You just kind of have generic science classes. But for one reason or another, I think my kind of analytical brain really wanted to know how things worked, what went into, manufacturing processes and things like that. I was definitely a curious kid. And then I went to school for chemistry, had the opportunity to do 2 summers of undergraduate research at Furman University, and really realized that being in a lab was something I enjoyed a lot, collaborating with the lab team, working on problems and research, and just, formulating in the lab was something I really did enjoy and wanted to pursue professionally. When I got to Chicago, I did have an opportunity to work at a place called Axion Labs. And the main thing we did there was train people on how to use instrumentation that is actually used in the cannabis industry and any real regulatory industry. Anyone who's making products has to test them somehow so that they can get on the market and so that consumers know that they're safe. So a lot of our clients when I was working at that training lab were pharmaceutical companies, food companies, oil, petroleum type companies, corn processing, all kinds of things across the board. But also, NASA has a GCMS on a space station that they run, environmental. Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff. It's really technology that's kind of used super broadly, but a lot of, just traditional consumers don't realize kind of all the work that goes into getting products onto the market. So it's a real joy to get to work in that position and learn about the strength, the power of chromatography and of that kind of analysis, and kind of hone my skills as an analytical chemist. And then I moved to Southern California, was looking for positions that used that experience that I had in GCMS and HPLC, LCMS, those kind of things. And a lot of the jobs that were open were in cannabis compliance labs because last year was California's first full year of having compliance testing for all their cannabis products. So it's truly kind of the the newest frontier in analytical chemistry. If you look at any of the major analytical companies are all now trying to crack into the cannabis market, because it's just, oil companies that have been around for decades, the pharmaceutical companies, they have all the LCMSs that they need, but cannabis and CBD products along with that, hemp products, when I say cannabis, I kind of just mean it all encompassing. Some people hear cannabis and they just think, THC and those kind of products, but it really is an all encompassing word. But yeah, and I was kind of thrilled by that, because I think that this industry kind of, obviously you have a passion for it as well, and that everyone watching does too. This industry is really exciting in terms of what we have left to find out about it and what the power of hemp and of cannabis is. And it's really cool to kind of get to be on the inside of that.
Nice. So did you have a little chemistry lab as a kid growing up? Like a lot of us had it when we was like elementary school and things like that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I definitely was into things like I would mix stuff together just to see what happened, and a lot of times we were talking about like food, nothing really happens. But I was the kid who wanted to see what happened when you mix vinegar and baking soda and making a mess. And for a long time before I really narrowed in on chemistry, I was the kid who would dig in the backyard to try to find, I thought I was going to be an archaeologist. I was just always looking for something. I got really into the show CSI when it first came out. I was the biggest CSI fan. And that's all. I was so excited as kind of when I got to school and I saw the analytical chemistry department at my school. It was all the same instruments that they used on the show that I liked, and it was so that I definitely did have from a young age. I don't know if I was Bill Nye putting my goggles on or anything, but I definitely had some of those tendencies.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's wonderful because a lot of us, when we come to being in the science field, we have that as growing up as kids. We're so hands-on with things. We break things apart just to see how it works.
Absolutely.
When it comes to like you said, digging in the backyard for bones and things like that. It's really fun. So I know you brought up about NASA and things like that. Just briefly, is it a big jump when you go from that type of testing to coming over to cannabis? Is there major changes you have to make to any equipments, or is it just the normal equipment that they have already?
Sure, that's a great question. I think one of the biggest complications with cannabis is that it's a really complex matrix. So, what that means is the plant itself, all the things that make it so unique and individualized, cannabis, hemp, whatever you're talking about, are things that make it difficult to work with as a sample. So you think about how sticky resin can get and how you have solid plant material in a lot of things. Even oil, as we see a lot of CBD products exist, is a difficult thing to test on chromatography instruments, because when we do the testing, an injection occurs. So if we're talking about an LC, that's liquid chromatography. So it's a liquid injection. That's a little bit more forgiving as long as you can get everything that's in the sample into a liquid. Then you're good. You can inject it on a liquid chromatography instrument. For gas chromatography, you want the whole sample to vaporize. So when you think about the way we consume flowers, sure, we vaporize product, but there's a whole lot left. It's not like you can just inject plants into something and expect it to become a gas. So when you're comparing it to something like the petroleum industry, petroleum is pretty easy to test for stuff like that, because everything is just hydrocarbons. It's very willing to go into a gaseous phase to become a gas. So we do have to kind of consider how complex that cannabis matrix is when we're preparing our SOPs, are the way that we carry out all of our preps for samples. We have to be sure that the operating procedures that we're using do get the compounds that we're looking for into solution, and so that they do vaporize on the instrumentation. So yeah, it is kind of a tricky transition into the cannabis world, just because of the nature of how complex the plants are.
Oh, nice, nice. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Is there when would you use a liquid over gas or gas over liquid when you're testing?
Great question. So for our lab specifically, we use liquid chromatography for potency. So that's when we're talking about measuring the cannabinoids that are present, your CBD, CBD.A, THC, THCA, CBN. We test for 10 different ones as required by the state. And we also use liquid chromatography for pesticide testing. California has a panel of about 60 required pesticides that we look for. And we use GCMS for terpenes and residual solvents. So the main difference there is volatility. So for GCMS, with solvents, the solvents that we're looking for are all easily enter the gas phase. So you're talking about methanol can become a gas very easily. It has a low boiling point. So anything that has a low, an accessible boiling point, methanol, ethanol, more toxic things like triethylbenzene is a thing that we test for. That's a really nasty solvent. These are things that can come about in the manufacturing process. So solvents are used to strip cannabinoids from cannabis. So we have to make sure that harmful solvents aren't still sticking around in products before they're put onto the market. So when you're talking about solvents, they're really volatile. They're really able to enter the gas phase. So we can easily use a gas chromatograph for testing things like that. Same for terpenes. Terpenes are what makes our products, what makes cannabis and hemp products taste and smell certain ways. So different strains have different terpenes. And when you're talking about scents, anything that you can smell, it's because it's entering the air from the product. It's literally leaving the flower and filling the jar that it's in, or, anything like that. We can smell it because it's gaseous, because it's entering a gas phase. So it really has to do with the nature of what you're testing for, and things like CBD and pesticides aren't as they don't as readily enter the gas phase.
Oh, nice. So to pick up on that, can you let's explain to the community why it's important to test for like pesticides, heavy metals, residual solvents, and things like mycotoxins?
Sure. So I think we kind of saw last year with a lot of the kind of like vaping crisis, so I think how the news like to talk about it, that it is really important that we're testing products that we're consuming. We're used to just being able to buy things at a grocery store and not worry about what's in them. And that's because the FDA has pretty strict requirements for what can and cannot be in food products. Similar for pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceutical companies have to meet very strict regulations for what can go on the market. So the cannabis industry had to set those kind of limits as well. And the reasoning being that we don't, for instance, there's a pesticide, I think it's called myclobutanol, and when it's heated, it produces cyanide gas. So I don't think anyone who's smoking wants to be inhaling cyanide. That's poisonous. So the BCC, the Bureau of Cannabis Control for California, has set their regulations based on FDA regulations for pharmaceuticals, for food, and has tried to really put thought and research into, well, myclobutanol, we don't want that to be in products that are going to be heated. So we have to set a specific, level that we don't want products to pass because that may put consumers in danger. Really similar for, we test for heavy metals as well. We, as a general public, know the dangers of things like lead, of things like mercury. Of arsenic is one of the other heavy metals we test for. And lead poisoning, it's something that adults can kind of, it may not be as affected by it, but you're talking about products that will be administered to sick people, especially when you're talking about CBD products. They may be administered to people who have lower immunity defenses, cancer patients, things like that. So you don't want them to also have to be worrying about lead poisoning, or black mold is one of the things that we test for. Aspergillus niger is what the nerdy microbiologists around call it. But that's the thing that, like, when we find it in our houses, we tear it out. You can get sick. So it's just a matter of making sure that these things that we have varying levels of knowing their toxicity to us. But because we do know that there's danger involved or, associated with those things already, with some carcinogens that are known, we have to be able to set a threshold that these products can't pass.
Yes, I was talking to one of my friends this morning. He's a survivor of Hodgkin lymphoma, and he says that if he ingest or inhale any mycotoxins, he could die because his system is just really low, his immune system. So it's this is why we're so proponents of lab testing. It's important. It's not just regular people who's not sick who have to worry about it. You have to think about those who are immune system low, and especially now that a lot of us are giving our kids product.
That's another one. Yeah.
So
yeah, for sure.
I have another question. Can you break down why they call it COA versus a lab report? I know everybody they hear different terms, and
Sure.
can you just break it down a little bit more for us in the terms
of? I think the scientific world is very interested in abbreviations, just so that we can kind of shorten up all our conversations and lingo. Lab report is certainly a perfect understanding of what a COA is. All COA stands for is Certificate of Analysis. So anytime our lab buys a standard that we measure, that we have to calibrate our instruments with, it comes with its own certificate of analysis. So it's not just us creating that COA. We receive COAs for products all the time. It's just kind of how the scientific world is literally a certification that that product that we're receiving has been tested by typically an ISO certified lab, which just kind of gives you, it just means that your lab has kind of been given permission by international standards for lab testing, that you didn't just, set up shop in your garage and no one has come to check out if you're doing everything right. Typically if someone's issuing a COA, it means that they have done a lot of work to become a certified testing lab, and that then they can give that product a seal of approval, basically, with that COA, certificate of analysis. It just means it's been analyzed. It just means it's, if the products were your parents, they'd put it on your fridge, it says, this one's okay.
Awesome. So I know one of the things about a COA is the LOD and LOQ. Can you just briefly talk about the difference? A lot of the community members have asked me, and is there a simplified version that you can just explain to community members?
Absolutely. That is a common question from our clients as well. It's not intuitive. If you didn't know, why would you have any reason to know what LOD, and it's on every single COA? What does that mean? So an LOD is simply the lowest level of the amount of something in a sample that can be detected by our instrumentation. For instance, if we are using our HPLC to test for CBD, our LOD for that is relatively low. We're getting a readout from the instrumentation that kind of looks like an EKG. It's like a flat line that has peaks every time an analyte is detected. So when we detect the lowest amount that we can be confident and say, this is CBD, and we see a very small peak, that's what that LOD represents. Now, because that peak is so small, we set one other requirement, and that is the LOQ. So the difference between the two is the LOD is the limit of detection. That is any amount that we can actually see, and we could say, yes, there is CBD in this product. The LOQ is the limit of quantification. That means that is the lowest amount that we would need to see and be confident in telling you how much of that product is present. So we may be able to see a very small CBD peak, but we're not confident in being able to say there is 1 ppm, for instance. There is 1 milligram per gram is often a measurement that you would see on a COA. There's 1 milligram per gram of CBD in this product. You know what? I'm not positive that there's 1 milligram per gram, but anything that's over that LOQ, that limit of quantification, I'm positive. I can tell you with assurance that there is 3 ppm or 3 milligrams per gram in this product. So the difference is I can see it. If you kind of think about looking at something from far away, right? I can see that this sign is yellow, it's triangular, but I'm not positive what that sign is trying to tell me. But I can see the sign is there. As I get closer to it, I can see it's a yield sign. It says yield. It's very obviously yield. So that we think of that LOQ as being like more, we're sure that there is X amount of product. I know exactly what that sign is. It says the yield sign. The LOD is like, I see the yellow sign, it's there, but I'm not sure what the sign is, or how, what kind of sign it is. The rule of thumb, if you don't have a specific LOD, LOQ test set up, sometimes this varies. The rule of thumb is that the LOQ is 3 times the LOD. So the LOD may be very, very low, and 3 times that is where we're more confident that we're reporting a specific amount of that product.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you. So let's say that either 2 things happen. You detect like residual solvents or pesticides, or even the LOQ, LOD is, let's say 0, for example. What is the next steps that you have to do when you either have a bad test or nothing at all?
Sure. So when we're doing testing, we test products with, first of all, we have some quality controls so that we'll run a sample that we know the exact amount of what we're looking for to make sure that our instrument is detecting whatever analytes we're looking for at the right level. So we'll say, hey, this sample has 10 ppm of methanol in it, and the instrument will say, yes, it does. And we have to be sure that that's true, and the BCC has regulations set up where you have to be within a certain window for your quality controls for any of the information that you use to be valid. Because if you tell your instrument, hey, I'm going to run something, it's going to be 10 ppm methanol, and then the instrument spits back out, oh, that's 20 ppm methanol, then I have a problem because that's inaccurate. The instrument isn't calibrated right. So once we're sure that our instrument is calibrated correctly and we run a sample on it, the main things that we're making sure of when we review that information that the instrument gives us is that that peak that has appeared on that chromatogram is actually what we think it is. When we say MS at the end of GCMS, LCMS, that MS is a mass spec. The mass spec has a vast library that we can consult and say, hey, is this peak methanol? And the library spits back out, yes, that matches the results that I have for methanol. So it's a very, very powerful tool in terms of being able to identify specific compounds. So if we get a result that, if we get a clean sample and it doesn't have, it has some peaks here and there, but it doesn't have any of our like solvents of interest, it doesn't have anything that can be harmful in it, we consider that a good thing. As long as it looks like the sample was run accurately, then congratulations, that distributor, whoever made that product, made a clean sample. And I don't know, probably 9 times out of 10, maybe a little less than 70% of the time, that's what we're looking at is clean stuff. But it still has to be tested. We didn't know it was clean before we tested it, but that's what we want. As a lab, we want things to be clean. We're not looking to, bring the hammer down. We want everything to be clean because then it means that people are getting clean products. But if we get something that comes back and it has a huge spike for a prohibited pesticide, say a pesticide with a really low action limit, action limit being like the level it cannot exceed to be able to pass our compliance testing. So action limits vary based on the toxicity of what you're talking about. So things like ethanol have a very high action limit because ethanol is not that toxic to us. A lot of us drink it. But, something that's more harmful would have a lower action limit because if we have even a small amount, that is dangerous. If we get something that's above that action limit, the BCC mandates that we retest that sample at least twice so that we can confirm that hit, so that we can see that, yes, we did reproduce that is actually present. That goes for pesticides, solvents, microbials, everything that we test for. We have to test it at least 3 times before we can say this is definitely failing for this compound. When it comes to microbials specifically, that can take some time because you have to think about microbials need time to grow. If they're going to grow to be tested or detected, then we have to kind of let them incubate, and that process takes some time. Fortunately, most of the other testing we do, if we have to retest the sample, it's a matter of going back to that flower or that tincture or whatever it was that we were testing, going through the dilution process, re-prepping it to get it put back onto that analytical instrument and running it again. Most of the runs themselves, like tests, take anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes per sample. So we're talking about, we could go from, we have a hit of X pesticide. We have to see if it's a real hit, if we can reproduce that hit, and re-prepping and getting that back on the instrument probably from start to finish can take about an hour. It's really, the main thing that we want to be sure of is that it's not a false positive. We don't want to fail a product when it is actually clean. And we want to be sure that we know what level of the analyte is present. So there are a lot of things in place that we have to go through to ensure that is going to fail for our compliance testing. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. So let's say you tested it 3 times, maybe you did it 5 times, and it still fails. Do you have to report it to the BCC or to like any federal agency?
Yes. So we have 2 different types of testing at Encore. One we refer to just simply as R&D testing. You can cherry pick which tests you want. Maybe you only want to test for pesticides, or you only want a heavy metals test. there's something that you're concerned about, you're still developing a product, and you want to, or maybe like a distributor wants to buy a flower from a cultivator and they want to test like one thing before they buy it, so that maybe they test it for pesticides. That information is not required to be reported to the state, but those products still can't go on the market. For a cannabis product to go on the market in California, it has to have what we call California compliance testing. It has to, or sometimes they call it a COA test. So anything that is being submitted as a compliance test, as a compliance panel of testing, so that that product can go on the market, is reported to the BCC. Those results are reported to the BCC within 24 hours of the completion of the test. So, like you said, we've tested it once, we tested it 2 more times. Like you said, sometimes we might retest it just because we want to be completely sure. We want more information is always better than less information. So, passing or failing, we report those results to the BCC. They want to know what every product has in store for the consumers of California. So we do. That's when I started at Encore, for the better part of my time here, I've been focused on the residual solvents and terpenes testing. For the past few months, I've actually been acting as a quality assurance manager because our quality assurance manager has been on maternity leave. So I stepped into those shoes and have been filling that role. So my main duties in that role are to comb through all the data that has been accumulated for that product, to make sure that all of the quality control type things we had in place have been checked off, and to make sure that those results do look sound, again, whether it's passing or failing. If it's failing, then I have a little bit more work to do, because I want to be sure that all those failing tests are all there. We can, if the client comes back to us, we can show them exactly what it looked like when the analyte failed. We can give them some advisory type information about how they might be able to remediate that sample, because that is a possibility. The BCC kind of mandates that you present them with a remediation plan for instance, if something failed because it had microbials in it, any kind of microbial growth, they have the option to use things like UV light to sterilize the product. And they can present what their plan is to the BCC and then resubmit that sample to us. We can test it again, and if it passes that time, then they're good. So that it's not there's some things that are more difficult to remediate. There's some times where people use UV sterilization and they still have a microbial issue. It's definitely not oh, this failed, we'll just go back to the drawing board, throw some other clean stuff in it, send it back, it'll be fine. They have to go through a pretty strict set of remediation rules and plans. They have to be very clear with the BCC about what's going to be done, and the BCC knows exactly when that sample is being retested, so they can't just run off to another lab and get, and just see if it works there. It's pretty, there's a lot of things in place to track dirty samples.
So thank you. So I have 3 last questions, and the first is, based on that last conversation, what will it take for, say, the BCC to shut them down? Because right now, especially with the USDA laws, people are worried that they'll especially like a farm, they'll have to worry that they get hot and they get shut down. Is there a high ceiling that you have to reach for the government to say, hey, we need to shut you down because you are exceeding limits on your testing?
Actually, do think there's probably a pretty high threshold for them to just, especially, I don't even know if they have a plan in place for every single product that this this company's putting out is failing. We have to put a stop to this. I think right now the main things that they're kind of cracking down on are licensing. They want to be sure that companies in California are properly licensed for what they're producing, what they're distributing, and they want to be sure that people are going through those testing processes. I do know that, like, the kind of example that you described, like, oh man, there's a lot of stuff coming out of here that's not looking great. The BCC may have a site visit, may just go and kind of try to look into what are the causes for how dirty these samples seem to be. I know that they have those kind of regulatory efforts in place. Like I said, I think it kind of would take a lot for them to just come in and shut someone down, especially if they had all of their proper permissions to do what they were doing. Now, if they don't, they're going to come in and shut that down pretty quick. If the BCC finds that there are cannabis companies and distributors and dispensaries in California that are operating without proper legal permissions, those are the stories that you'll see the most commonly coming out of the California cannabis industry when it's coming to places that are getting shut down or licenses being revoked. It's because people are trying to do things under the table. They just don't have all the right permissions to do what they're doing. But they definitely will do site visits if they see that a company is consistently having issues.
Awesome. Thank you for that. That was one of the biggest questions we get a lot from brands. So I have a question from Tracy. She says she's very curious on your thoughts on heavy metal testing of empty vape cartridges. She has a vape line and they already use cartridges with third party, and she's want to know how accurate that information is and anything, any testing standards that you have in place when it comes to testing for heavy metals.
Sure, that's a great question. It's actually a pretty popular test, especially, again, in the light of the vaping kind of crises of last year. So what we would do is if someone wanted to test an empty cartridge, typically we would actually put liquid in it. So we would put, like, probably hemp oil. We have a decent amount of hemp oil around that we use as kind of a matrix standard. We spike analytes onto it to know what certain amounts look like in oil. But for this test in particular, we would fill the cartridge with that hemp oil, and then maybe leave it for a week, maybe leave it for 2 weeks. Typically, it's kind of the client's discretion how long. If they're looking for, we would call that a leaching test. So if you're looking for whether your cartridges could leach dangerous metal, lead, or anything else into the oil itself, then we can literally, measure, well, over the course of 2 weeks, this amount of lead leached into your oil. We can also do we can literally just put the cartridge into the digester that we use to digest samples before they get analyzed for heavy metals. That one is a little less, I would say, accurate to how cartridges are used, because it's not like when you use a cartridge, you're melting the whole thing down and consuming it, and that's basically what that test would do is melt it down, is break it down into its component metals so that we can test and see what kind of metals were used in it. That doesn't mean that's not interesting information. That doesn't mean that's not useful information to know exactly what metals were used in the manufacturing of that cartridge. But I would say, from my perspective as a consumer, as someone who works in a lab like this, what is more pertinent information is that leach test. You want to know if, when you put oil into a cartridge, is the cartridge leaching into the oil. And I know there's also some concerns about temperatures used in vapes. different vape setting temperatures, possibly introducing more harmful components into the vape that's being smoked. You know, that's something I think we're still going to have to try to do a little more targeted research on. I don't necessarily, I think that would probably be a stretch goal for a lab like ours to be able to establish some kind of R&D project. We've done some R&D projects internally thus far just to kind of see shelf life potency type studies. Those things are definitely, like I said, stretch goals, long-term goals for our lab as we build out over the next year or so. So in terms of like temperature testing, I'm not sure. I can't really speak to that. But in terms of leach testing, I think that's something that is pretty necessary for those kinds of cartridges.
So what do you mean about in the future? Because I was going to ask you, I was like, is there a difference between just testing, adding the oil in there versus actually heating the vape cartridge and then test it? But that's something that's what you're referring to in the future, or is that something that you currently do?
Yes, I think that's something that eventually we may be able to determine more like temperature-based health, you know, adversarial effects to your health. I would say, though, that the BCC, when they set up the regulations for what levels of things can and cannot be present in products, there are slightly different regulations for products that are meant to be inhaled versus products that are meant to be consumed because of that heating element. Because if you're inhaling something, you're talking about heating it, you're talking about taking it into your lungs. And the BCC, when they set their regulations, took that into account. They do have lower action levels for some compounds if they are meant to be inhaled components as opposed to ingested, because ingestion would just be, you know, you're talking about your digestive system. It's a little less delicate than taking an air into your lungs and having it just enter your whole, you know, body. That gets into, you know, some anatomy type stuff, not really my forte, but that's kind of what I would say in response is like the BCC has thought about stuff like that. Do I think that there's been much study done into like this temperature versus this temperature versus this temperature? No. And I think that's something that we're only going to keep. It's one more thing on the list of things that we're only going to keep trying to learn more about.
Cool. So Tracy said, thank you so much. She appreciated the question. She just have a quick feedback on that. She says, during the process, like the leach test process, do you periodically heat the oil at all, or do you just let it sit at room temperature?
Good question. We do not have in our standard operating procedures that those would be heated. But if a client requested that, we'd absolutely do it for them. All of our testing would be done at room temperature. If we did add oil to a cartridge, we would just kind of, you know, set it aside in room temperature storage for whatever length of leach testing the client requested. But, you know, that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be pretty simple for us to do what you're suggesting. When the sample is digested, the digester does use heat and acid to break down the product itself. So there's like some, you know, there's some heat involved in the process, but for what you're talking about, for what you're suggesting, no, that's not necessarily typically what we would do with the leach test by heating up the cartridge after we added hemp to it, or hemp oil to it, excuse me. But it's not out of the realm of something we could accomplish if a client wanted that.
Awesome, thank you. So my final question is, I'm a client. I say, hey, I want to get started. What do I do?
Yeah, great question for you know, all our sales team here at Encore. So you really just need to set up an account with Encore in some way. and we're open to, you know, all comers. Our main clients are distributors of cannabis products, but we also service a lot of CBD companies. And so once an account is set up, the samples can be submitted. We can, if you're in California, come pick those up. If you're, you know, too far away, or you don't, or all you want is that R&D type testing, you can mail them in. You can drop it off if you're in the Pasadena area. But we do receive non-THC samples in the mail. That's got to be made pretty clear. Nobody's shipping THC across state lines. That's illegal. But for samples that are legal to for interstate commerce, we can receive those in the lab. And you know, as long as we know something's coming, as long as we have you set up as a client, we're happy to get things prepped and tested for you. Usually things are turnaround time, you know, 3 days typically, which is pretty good. You know, if you need it quicker than that, we could do it quicker than that. And you know, if something comes up, we might push it to 4, but typically around 3-day turnaround times for most of our samples. And that's all it really takes. We have a great contact form type set up on our website. It's encore-labs.com. And that would be all the information that we would need for a potential client.
Nice. Do you offhand, would you know that, I know you work more in the lab, the prices for like just for basic testing or for like pesticide testing?
It's kind of all over the place, but even for, I know pesticides, for instance, off the top of my head, I think it's about $75 for a sample. So it's slightly cost prohibitive for someone who's just kind of like a consumer who wants to be sure that there's not something sticking around. But in terms of overall pricing, it's not really my, it's kind of, you know, outside of my pay grade, unfortunately. But we have a ton of, we have a great sales team who's willing to work with anybody on anything that they need tested. So we definitely don't want it to be cost prohibitive. So it's like I said, off the top of my head, I think if you just want a pesticide test, it's about $75. But other than that, I don't want to speak too much on those things. It's not really my bag.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I learned so much. I love doing these lives. It helps me be educated, and in return, I can educate the community. So I really, really, from the bottom of my heart, appreciate you taking this time out of your day to educate the community. So is there any final thoughts that you'd like to say?
It was an absolute pleasure, and I'm glad that there are people who want to know more about the testing that goes into these products. And I think the CBD industry in particular is pretty gray, pretty opaque where things like that are concerned. So I would say final thoughts, as a consumer, look into the products that you're buying. Go to their website, see if you can find COAs. If you can't interpret it, get in touch with a lab like ours. You know, ask them what that means. Google around, and if you still don't understand, you know, it is more worth you know, looking into as a consumer what you're taking, what you're interested in purchasing, than it is just going into all these things blind. So the more information you have, the more power you have. Work with and buy products with companies who are being as upfront as possible about their testing, because those are the products that you want. I truly believe that.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. I really appreciate you. And I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope you have a wonderful 2020. And best of luck with everything you got going on at Encore Labs.
Thank you so much, Devin. This has been a joy.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Bye. So before we leave, I just want to say thank you so much to Mary Beth once again. I want to say thank you to our wonderful sponsors, the Gold Spectrum, and also Comma CBD for sponsoring Hemp Hotline and all the education things that we are doing here at CB Reviews and CB.how. Please have a wonderful day. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to Encore Labs at ENCORE-labs CBD.com for information, or just email us at media@CBD.how. Appreciate you. Have a beautiful, beautiful day. Thank you all. Good night.
There are those that said your pain isn't real. Too slow. Too hard. Too soft. Too old. Too limited. To them, we say too bad. Everyone deserves good and clean CBD products.